Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the absolutely mind-blowing saga of ancient Korea's three kingdoms, and I'm talking about nearly 1,000 years of warrior poets, brilliant generals, and the most strategically complex political chess match in East Asian history, where kingdoms rose from legends and fell through betrayals that changed the course of civilization. So smash that like button if you're ready to learn about the folks who built fortress cities so impregnable they defeated Chinese armies 10 times their size, then filled them with Buddhist temples so beautiful they influenced art across Asia. Hit subscribe for more epic historical sagas, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Now settle in, because we're exploring how a kingdom founded by a guy born from an egg became the terror of Northeast Asia, how the most refined kingdom mastered ancient diplomacy, and how the smallest kingdom played the longest political game in history and somehow conquered everyone else, all while creating one of the most sophisticated civilizations the ancient world had ever seen. In the misty mountains of ancient Korea, where dragons once soared between peaks and shamans whispered secrets to the wind, there began a tale so magnificent that even the gods paused their celestial games to watch. This is the story of three kingdoms that would dance together for nearly 7 centuries, their steps sometimes graceful, sometimes stumbling, but always captivating in their eternal waltz of power, culture, and human ambition. Picture, if you will, the Korean peninsula in the 1st century BCE, a land as wild and untamed as a teenager's bedroom, but infinitely more beautiful. The morning mist clung to emerald valleys like a silk hanbok, while ancient forests whispered stories that would make even the most seasoned storyteller weep with envy. It was here, in this land of impossible beauty, that our tale begins, not with a bang, but with a gentle rustle of silk and the soft footsteps of destiny. The peninsula was home to numerous tribes and small kingdoms, each as proud as a peacock and twice as colorful. These weren't your average ancient peoples, mind you. These were folks who could craft bronze so beautiful it would make modern artists weep, who built dolmens that still stand today, probably wondering why tourists keep taking selfies with them, and who had already figured out that rice and kimchi were the keys to happiness, though kimchi wouldn't arrive for another few centuries, so they had to make do with other fermented delights. Among these various peoples, 3 groups would rise to prominence, like the most epic boy band in history, except instead of synchronized dancing, they specialized in synchronized warfare, diplomacy, and the occasional bout of poetry. These were the kingdoms that would become known as Goguryeo, Baekje, and Silla, names that would echo through the corridors of time like a beautiful, complex harmony. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Every great story needs proper introductions, and these 3 kingdoms deserve nothing less than the red carpet treatment, complete with fanfare and perhaps a few scattered rose petals. In the northern reaches of the peninsula, where the Yalu River flows like liquid silver and the mountains touch the sky with their snow-capped fingers, there emerged a kingdom that would become legendary for its military prowess and territorial ambitions. This was Goguryeo, founded around 37 BCE by a man whose origin story reads like something out of a fantasy novel. Jumong, the founder of Goguryeo, was said to be the son of Haimosu, a divine being who descended from heaven, because apparently, even in ancient times, having a good origin story was crucial for political success. His mother, Yuo, was the daughter of a river god, which meant Jumong had both celestial and aquatic connections, basically the ancient equivalent of having both Wi-Fi and cellular data. The story goes that Jumong was born from an egg, which might sound unusual until you remember that this was a time when people regularly consulted with spirits and considered it perfectly normal for shamans to predict the weather by examining chicken entrails. An egg birth was practically mundane by comparison. What wasn't mundane was Jumong's incredible skill with a bow. He could apparently shoot arrows with such precision that he could thread a needle from 100 paces, though one wonders why anyone would need to thread needles from such a distance. Perhaps ancient Korean tailoring was more extreme than we realize. Fleeing political persecution. A timeless theme that resonates even today, Jumong traveled north with his followers, crossing rivers and mountains until he found the perfect spot to establish his kingdom. He chose a location that was strategically brilliant, mountainous enough to provide natural defenses, but with enough fertile valleys to support agriculture. It was like finding the perfect apartment. Great location, good bones, and room to expand. Goguryeo would grow to become the largest of the three kingdoms, eventually controlling territory that stretched from the Korean peninsula deep into what is now China and Russia. They were the overachievers of the ancient world, the type of kingdom that would probably have had the highest GPA there had been an ancient kingdom report card. Meanwhile, in the southwestern part of the peninsula, another kingdom was taking shape. Baekje, founded around 18 BCE, had an origin story that was equally dramatic, but with a different flavor. According to legend, it was established by Anjo, who is either the son of Jumong, making this a family affair, or the son of another royal figure, depending on which historian you ask. Ancient record-keeping was apparently as reliable as modern weather forecasting. What made Baekje special wasn't just its royal lineage, but its location and character. Situated in the fertile plains of the southwest, Baekje became the kingdom of culture, trade, and diplomacy. If Goguryeo was the warrior of the family, Baekje was the artist and the merchant. They were the ones who would later become famous for their exquisite art, their sophisticated court culture, and their ability to maintain trade relationships that spanned continents. Baekje's capital, initially located in what is now Seoul, yes, that Seoul, was positioned perfectly for both defense and commerce. The Han River provided a natural highway for trade, while the surrounding mountains offered protection. It was like having a house with both a great view and a security system. The people of Baekje developed a reputation for refinement that would make even the French court jealous. They were master craftsmen, creating pottery, metalwork, and textiles that were sought after across East Asia. Their Buddhist temples were architectural marvels, and their court ceremonies were so elaborate that they probably needed a full-time protocol officer just to keep track of who bowed to whom and when. But perhaps the most intriguing of our three protagonists was Silla, the kingdom that would eventually unite the peninsula, but started as the smallest and seemingly least likely to succeed. Founded around 57 BCE in the southeastern part of the peninsula, Silla was like the quiet kid in class, who everyone underestimated until they suddenly became class president, valedictorian, and homecoming king all in the same year. Silla's origin story is delightfully unique. According to legend, the kingdom was founded when 6 village chiefs gathered and decided they needed a king. They climbed to the top of a mountain and prayed for guidance, and lo and behold, a bright light appeared, and from it emerged a golden box containing a beautiful boy. They named him Hyasvios, and he became the first king of Silla. It's the kind of story that makes you wonder if ancient Koreans had a particular fondness for dramatic entrances, or if their gods just had a flair for theatrical presentation. What made Silla different from its neighbors wasn't just its mysterious founding, but its social structure and approach to governance. While Goguryeo and Baekje followed more traditional monarchical systems, Silla developed a unique bone rank system that determined social status and political power. It was like a caste system, but with more poetic names. People were classified into categories like sacred bone and true bone, which sounds much more elegant than simply saying upper class and middle class. This system, while rigid, actually provided a certain stability that would serve Silla well in the centuries to come. It created clear hierarchies and expectations, reducing some of the internal conflicts that plagued other kingdoms. It was like having a very detailed organizational chart that everyone understood and accepted, even if they didn't always like their position on it. As these three kingdoms established themselves and began to grow, the peninsula entered what historians call the Three Kingdoms period, though it's worth noting that there were actually more than three kingdoms at various times. It's like calling it a triangle when it's really more of a polygon. But Three Kingdoms has a much better ring to it than several kingdoms, plus some smaller political entities. The early centuries of this period were marked by a complex dance of expansion, alliance, and conflict. Each kingdom had its own strengths and weaknesses, its own ambitions and fears, and its own approach to the fundamental challenges of ancient statecraft. How to feed your people, defend your borders, and maintain power without everyone deciding they'd rather have someone else in charge. Goguryeo, with its northern location and military tradition, found itself frequently at odds with Chinese dynasties. This wasn't necessarily by choice. When you're the northernmost kingdom on the peninsula, you're essentially the first line of defense against any ambitious Chinese emperor who decides he'd like to add Korea to his collection. It was like living in the house closest to the highway. You're going to get more traffic, whether you want it or not. The Chinese, for their part, viewed the Korean kingdoms with a mixture of respect, frustration, and occasional bewilderment. Here were these relatively small kingdoms that refused to simply roll over and accept Chinese dominance, despite being significantly outnumbered. It was like watching a group of determined house cats successfully fend off a pack of wolves through sheer attitude and strategic thinking. Goguryeo military prowess became legendary throughout East Asia. Their heavy cavalry was feared from the Yellow Sea to the steppes of Mongolia, and their fortress cities were considered nearly impregnable. They developed military tactics that combined the mobility of nomadic warfare with the defensive advantages of settled civilization, creating a hybrid approach that confounded their enemies and impressed their allies. But military might alone doesn't make a kingdom great, and Goguryeo leaders understood this. They also invested heavily in culture, education, and administration. They established schools, promoted literacy, and created a bureaucratic system that could effectively govern their vast territories. They were like the ancient equivalent of a tech startup that successfully scaled up. They maintained their innovative edge while building the infrastructure necessary to support their growth. Baekje, meanwhile, was playing a different game entirely. Rather than focusing primarily on military expansion, they became the masters of soft power centuries before the term was invented. They established trade networks that stretched across the Yellow Sea to China and south to the Japanese archipelago. Their merchants were welcome in ports from Shanghai to Kyushu, and their cultural influence spread far beyond their political borders. The Baekje court became renowned for its sophistication and learning. They were early adopters of Buddhism, which had arrived from China in the 4th century, and they transformed it into something uniquely Korean. Their temples weren't just places of worship. They were centers of learning, art, and culture. Monks didn't just pray. They taught, painted, sculpted, and served as diplomats and advisors. Baekje's approach to international relations was particularly sophisticated. They understood that in a world of larger, more powerful neighbors, survival often depended more on intelligence and diplomacy than on brute force. They became master negotiators, capable of playing different powers against each other while maintaining their own independence. It was like being the Switzerland of ancient East Asia, except with more elaborate court ceremonies and better food. Their cultural achievements were remarkable. Baekje artisans created some of the most beautiful Buddhist art in East Asia, with a distinctive style that influenced artistic development in both China and Japan. Their architecture was elegant and innovative, their literature was sophisticated, and their music was so renowned that Baekje musicians were sought after by courts throughout the region. Silla, the smallest of the three kingdoms, was quietly building something extraordinary. While Goguryeo and Baekje were focused on external expansion and influence, Silla was perfecting the art of internal development and strategic patience. They were like the tortoise in the famous fable, moving steadily forward while their flashier competitors exhausted themselves in dramatic sprints. The bone rank system, while rigid, created a society with clear expectations and strong social cohesion. People knew their place and their role, which reduced internal conflict and allowed the kingdom to focus its energies outward. It wasn't necessarily fair by modern standards, but it was effective, and in the brutal world of ancient politics, effectiveness often mattered more than fairness. Silla also developed a unique military tradition centered around the warang, an elite group of young nobles who combined martial training with cultural education. These weren't just warriors. They were poet-soldiers, philosopher-fighters who embodied the Silla ideal of balanced excellence. They studied literature and music as intensively as they practiced swordsmanship and archery. It was like having a military academy that also functioned as a liberal arts college. The Hwarang became legendary throughout Korea for their courage, loyalty, and cultural sophistication. They were the kingdom's elite force, but also its cultural ambassadors and future leaders. Many of Silla's greatest generals and administrators emerged from the Hwarang ranks, creating a leadership class that was both militarily capable and culturally refined. As the centuries passed, the relationship between the three kingdoms became increasingly complex. What had started as relatively simple territorial competition evolved into a sophisticated game of alliance, betrayal, and strategic maneuvering that would make modern diplomats dizzy just thinking about it. The 4th and 5th centuries saw the rise of Goguryeo as the dominant power on the peninsula. Under kings like Goguryeo the Great, whose name literally means broad expander of territory, which is about as subtle as naming your dog, Baekje, Goguryeo expanded its territory dramatically, pushing south into Baekje and Silla territory while simultaneously fighting off Chinese invasions from the north. Goguryeo the Great was one of those historical figures who seems almost too impressive to be real. During his 22-year reign, he conquered 64 walled cities and 1,400 villages, expanded Goguryeo territory to its greatest extent, and established his kingdom as the dominant power in Northeast Asia. He was like the ancient Korean equivalent of Alexander the Great, except he had to deal with much worse weather and probably didn't have as good a publicist. The famous Goguryeo stele, erected by his son to commemorate his achievements, still stands today in what is now China. It's one of the most important historical documents of ancient Korea, and reading it is like getting a glimpse into the mind of a medieval superhero. The inscription describes military campaigns with the enthusiasm of a sports commentator and the precision of a military historian, creating a document that is both informative and surprisingly entertaining. But Goguryeo success created a problem that would plague Goguryeo for centuries. They became too successful for their own good. Their expansion brought them into direct conflict with Chinese dynasties, who viewed a strong, unified Korean kingdom as a threat to their own security. It was like being the tallest poppy in the field. Eventually, someone's going to come along with a scythe. The Chinese response was predictable and overwhelming. They launched a series of massive invasions designed to crush Goguryeo once and for all. The most famous of these was the Goguryeo-Tang War in the early 7th century, followed by the even more devastating Goguryeo-Tang War. These weren't small border skirmishes. These were full-scale invasions involving hundreds of thousands of troops and representing some of the largest military campaigns in ancient East Asian history. The Sui dynasty, confident in their superior numbers and resources, launched what they expected to be a quick, decisive campaign against Goguryeo. They assembled an army of over 300,000 men, supported by a massive naval force, and invaded in 598 CE. It should have been a walkover. Instead, it turned into one of the most spectacular military disasters in Chinese history. The Goguryeo forces, led by the brilliant general Yulji Mundeok, employed a strategy that combined guerrilla tactics with conventional warfare in ways that completely confounded the Chinese commanders. They allowed the Chinese army to advance deep into Goguryeo territory, stretching their supply lines and exhausting their troops. then struck with devastating effectiveness. The Battle of Salsu River in 612 CE became legendary throughout East Asia. Yulji Mundiok lured the Chinese army across the river, then destroyed the dam upstream, flooding the battlefield and trapping the Chinese forces. Of the 300,000 Chinese soldiers who had crossed the river, only 2,700 made it back. It was such a complete disaster that it contributed to the fall of the entire Sui dynasty. Imagine losing so badly at a game that the game company goes out of business. That's essentially what happened to the Sui. But these wars, while ultimately successful for Goguryeo, came at an enormous cost. The kingdom's resources were stretched to the breaking point. Its population was exhausted by constant warfare, and its southern borders were left vulnerable to attack from Baekje and Silla. It was like winning a boxing match, being so battered that you can't defend yourself against the next challenger. Baekje and Silla, meanwhile, were watching these northern conflicts with the keen interest of spectators at a particularly violent sporting event. They understood that Goguryeo-Tang's wars with China created opportunities for them, but they also realized that they needed to be careful not to get caught in the crossfire. Baekje, under King Seong, decided to take advantage of Goguryeo-Tang's distraction by launching their own expansion campaign. They moved their capital south to Sabi, modern-day Bayou, and began pushing into territory that had previously been under Goguryeo control. It was a risky strategy, like trying to steal cookies while the adults are fighting, but it initially paid off handsomely. King Seong was one of those rulers who combined military ambition with cultural sophistication in ways that made him both feared and admired. He expanded Baekje's territory, strengthened its military, and simultaneously presided over a golden age of art and culture. Under his reign, Baekje Buddhism reached new heights of sophistication, with temples and monasteries that were architectural marvels. The famous Myuruksa Temple, built during this period, was one of the largest Buddhist temples in East Asia, with a 9-story wooden pagoda that could be seen from miles away. It was like building a medieval skyscraper, except instead of offices, it was filled with monks contemplating the nature of existence. But King Seong's ambitions ultimately led to his downfall. In 554 CE, he launched what he intended to be a decisive campaign against Silla, aiming to expand Baekje's territory to the east. The campaign started well, with Baekje forces achieving several early victories. However, Seong made the classic mistake of getting overconfident and personally leading a charge against a Silla fortress. He was killed in the battle, and his death sent shockwaves throughout Baekje that would take decades to overcome. It was one of those moments in history where a single decision changes everything. If Seong had stayed back and let his generals handle the fighting, Baekje might have successfully expanded eastward and changed the entire balance of power on the peninsula. Instead, his death marked the beginning of Baekje's gradual decline and Silla's rise to prominence. Silla, meanwhile, was quietly building the foundations of what would eventually become their dominance. While their neighbors were exhausting themselves in costly wars, Silla was perfecting their internal systems and carefully choosing their battles. They were like the student who studies consistently all semester while their classmates cram at the last minute. When test time came, they were ready. The Silla approach to expansion was methodical and strategic. Rather than launching dramatic campaigns for quick territorial gains, they focused on gradually absorbing smaller kingdoms and consolidating their control over the southeastern part of the peninsula. They were particularly successful in incorporating the Gaia Confederacy, a collection of small kingdoms that had managed to maintain their independence through a combination of diplomatic skill and geographic luck. The Gaia kingdoms were fascinating in their own right. They were master metalworkers, creating some of the finest iron weapons and tools in East Asia. Their burial mounds, filled with elaborate grave goods, suggest a society that was both wealthy and sophisticated. But they were also small and fragmented, making them vulnerable to absorption by their larger neighbors. It was like being a collection of successful small businesses in an industry that was rapidly consolidating. Eventually, you either get bought out or get squeezed out. Silla's absorption of Gaya was accomplished through a combination of military pressure, diplomatic negotiation, and cultural assimilation. Rather than simply conquering and occupying, they offered Gaya elites positions in the Silla hierarchy, incorporated Gaya military units into their own forces, and allowed local customs to continue under Silla oversight. It was conquest with a human face, and it proved to be remarkably effective. The 6th and 7th centuries marked a period of extraordinary cultural development across all three kingdoms. It was as if the constant political and military competition had created a parallel competition in art, literature, philosophy, and technology. Each kingdom was determined not just to outfight their neighbors, but to outshine them culturally as well. Buddhism played a central role in this cultural flowering. The religion had arrived from China in the 4th century, but by the 6th century, it had been thoroughly adapted to Korean conditions and sensibilities. Korean Buddhism wasn't simply a copy of Chinese Buddhism. It was a unique synthesis that incorporated elements of traditional Korean shamanism, Confucian ethics, and indigenous artistic traditions. The Buddhist temples of this period were marvels of architecture and engineering. The Bulguksa temple in Silla, begun in the 6th century, was designed as a representation of the Buddhist cosmos in stone and wood. Every element of the temple, from its foundation stones to its roof tiles, was carefully planned to reflect Buddhist cosmology and philosophy. Walking through the temple was meant to be a spiritual journey, with each courtyard and hall representing a different stage of enlightenment. The famous Siok Guram Grotto, also in Silla territory, housed a granite Buddhist statue that is considered one of the masterpieces of Buddhist art. Statue was carved from a single block of granite and positioned so that it faces east toward the rising sun. The technical skill required to create such a work in the 8th century was extraordinary. The sculptors had to understand not just artistic principles, but also engineering, geology, and astronomy. But it wasn't just religious art that flourished during this period. Secular art, literature, and music also reached new heights of sophistication. The three kingdoms developed distinctive artistic styles that reflected their different characters and values. Goguryeo art was bold and dynamic, reflecting the kingdom's military culture. Baekje art was elegant and refined, showing the influence of their sophisticated court culture. Silla art was more austere, but deeply spiritual, reflecting their Buddhist devotion and philosophical inclinations. The tomb paintings of Goguryeo provide a fascinating window into the daily life and beliefs of the ancient Korean elite. These aren't just decorative murals. They're complex narrative works that tell stories about the deceased, their achievements, and their hopes for the afterlife. The paintings show hunting scenes, court ceremonies, mythological creatures, and astronomical observations, creating a rich tapestry of ancient Korean culture. One of the most famous Goguryeo tomb paintings shows a hunting scene with such dynamic energy that the horses seem ready to gallop right off the wall. The artist captured not just the physical appearance of the hunt, but its emotional intensity, the excitement of the chase, the skill of the hunters, the wildness of the prey. It's the kind of art that makes you forget you're looking at something that's over 1,000 years old. Baekje's artistic achievements were equally impressive, but different in character. Their Buddhist sculptures and architectural decorations showed a refinement and elegance that influenced artistic development throughout East Asia. Famous Baekje smile, a subtle, serene expression found on many of their Buddhist statues, became a distinctive feature that was copied by artists in China and Japan. The Baekje court also developed a sophisticated literary culture. While most of their literature has been lost over the centuries, surviving fragments suggest a rich tradition of poetry, historical writing, and philosophical discourse. They were particularly known for their skill in Chinese classical literature, and Baekje scholars were sought after by courts throughout East Asia. Silla's cultural achievements were perhaps the most distinctive of the three kingdoms. Their development of a native writing system, using Chinese characters to represent Korean sounds, was a breakthrough that would eventually lead to the creation of the Korean alphabet. They also developed a unique poetic form called hyanga, which combined Korean linguistic structures with Chinese literary conventions. The hyanga poems that survive today provide a glimpse into the Silla worldview. They're deeply spiritual works that often deal with themes of impermanence, devotion, and the relationship between the human and divine worlds. Reading them is like overhearing a conversation between ancient Korean poets and their gods, intimate, profound, and surprisingly moving. The 7th century brought a new player to the East Asian political scene that would fundamentally change the dynamics of the Three Kingdoms period. The Tang dynasty, which came to power in China in 618 CE, was different from its predecessors in both its ambitions and its capabilities. If the previous Chinese dynasties had been content to maintain a loose hegemony over their neighbors, the Tang wanted direct control. The Tang dynasty represented the high point of Chinese imperial power. They controlled territory stretching from Korea to Central Asia, commanded armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands, and presided over a cultural and economic golden age that made China the envy of the known world. They were like the ancient equivalent of a global superpower, and they had the confidence and resources to back up their ambitions. For the Korean kingdoms, the rise of Tang China presented both opportunities and existential threats. The Tang were powerful enough to be valuable allies, but they were also dangerous enough to be potentially fatal enemies. It was like having a neighbor who was simultaneously the most helpful person on the block and the most likely to accidentally burn down your house while trying to help with your barbecue. The Tang approach to Korea was sophisticated and multifaceted. They used a combination of military pressure, diplomatic incentives, and cultural influence to try to bring the peninsula under their control. They offered trade opportunities and cultural exchanges to kingdoms that cooperated, while threatening military action against those that resisted. It was carrot-and-stick diplomacy on a massive scale. Goguryeo, as the largest and most militarily powerful of the Korean kingdoms, inevitably became the primary target of Tang ambitions. The Tang emperors viewed Goguryeo as the main obstacle to Chinese control of the peninsula, and they were determined to eliminate this obstacle once and for all. The Goguryeo-Tang wars that followed were some of the largest and most destructive conflicts in East Asian history. The Tang assembled armies that dwarfed anything seen in previous Chinese invasions of Korea. The first major campaign, launched in 645 CE, involved over 200,000 Chinese troops, supported by a massive naval force. It was like bringing a bazooka to a knife fight, except the knife fighters turned out to be much more skilled than anyone expected. The Tang forces were led by Emperor Taizong himself, one of the most capable military commanders in Chinese history. Taizong had conquered most of China and Central Asia, and he expected Korea to be just another addition to his growing empire. He had studied the failures of the Sui dynasty and was confident that he could succeed where they had failed. But Goguryeo had also learned from their previous conflicts with China. They had strengthened their fortifications, improved their military organization, and developed new tactics specifically designed to counter Chinese advantages in numbers and equipment. Most importantly, they had a new generation of military leaders who combined traditional Korean fighting skills with hard-won experience from decades of warfare. The siege of Ansi Fortress became the turning point of the campaign. The fortress, located in what is now northeastern China, was defended by a Goguryeo garrison under the command of a general whose name has been lost to history, but whose tactical brilliance saved his kingdom. The Tang forces, despite their overwhelming numerical superiority, were unable to take the fortress after months of siege. The defense of Ansi Fortress became legendary throughout East Asia. The Goguryeo defenders used every trick in the book and invented a few new ones to hold off the Chinese assault. They built counter walls to neutralize Chinese siege equipment, launched surprise sorties that disrupted Chinese operations, and even managed to capture some of the Tang's most advanced siege engines and turn them against their former owners. Emperor Taizong himself was wounded during the siege, struck by an arrow that may have been fired by the fortress commander himself. The wound wasn't fatal, but it was deeply humiliating for an emperor who had never been defeated in battle. After months of fruitless siege, Taizong was forced to withdraw, marking the first major military defeat of his career. The failure of the 645 campaign was a shock to the Tang court. They had expected a quick, decisive victory, and instead they had suffered a humiliating defeat that cost them enormous resources and prestige. It was like a heavyweight boxer being knocked out by a bantamweight, technically possible, but deeply embarrassing and hard to explain to the fans. But the Tang weren't ready to give up. They spent the next several years preparing for another invasion, this time with even more resources and better planning. They also began to explore alternative strategies, including the possibility of allying with Baekje and Silla against Goguryeo. This is where the story takes one of its most dramatic turns. Silla, which had been the smallest and seemingly weakest of the three kingdoms, made a decision that would change the course of Korean history. They decided to ally with Tang China against their fellow Korean kingdoms. The Silla decision to ally with Tang China was one of the most controversial moves in Korean history. From one perspective, it was a brilliant strategic calculation that allowed Silla to survive and eventually unify the peninsula. From another perspective, it was a betrayal of Korean independence that invited foreign domination. Historians are still debating the wisdom and morality of this decision more than 1,000 years later. The Silla leadership, led by King Mengmu and his brilliant general Kim Yu-sin, understood that they were facing an impossible situation. Tang China was determined to control the Korean peninsula, and they had the military power to achieve this goal eventually. Goguryeo, despite their military prowess, was exhausted by decades of warfare and couldn't hold out indefinitely against Chinese pressure. Baekje, while culturally sophisticated, lacked the military strength to resist a determined Chinese invasion. In this context, the Silla alliance with Tang China can be seen as a desperate gamble rather than a calculated betrayal. The Silla leadership believed that, by allying with China, they could survive the coming storm and perhaps eventually find a way to assert their independence once the immediate crisis had passed. It was like making a deal with the devil, but when the alternative is certain destruction, even the devil starts to look reasonable. The alliance was formalized in 660 CE, and its effects were immediate and dramatic. Combined Tang-Silla forces launched a coordinated assault on Baekje that caught the kingdom completely off guard. Baekje had been expecting to face either Tang or Silla forces, but not both simultaneously. It was like preparing for a boxing match and discovering that your opponent had brought a friend. The fall of Baekje was swift and brutal. The kingdom that had been renowned for its cultural sophistication and diplomatic skill was overwhelmed by the combined military might of its enemies. King Yuya, the last king of Baekje, was captured and taken to China as a prisoner, marking the end of nearly 7 centuries of Baekje independence. But the story of Baekje's fall isn't just a tale of military defeat. It's also a story of cultural tragedy. The destruction of Baekje meant the loss of countless works of art, literature, and scholarship. Libraries were burned, temples were destroyed, and scholars were scattered or killed. It was like watching a great university being demolished. The immediate loss was terrible, but the long-term cultural damage was incalculable. However, not all of Baekje's cultural heritage was lost. Many Baekje nobles, scholars, and artisans fled to Japan, where they were welcomed by the Japanese court. These refugees brought with them advanced knowledge of Buddhism, architecture, art, and literature that would profoundly influence Japanese cultural development. In a sense, Baekje lived on in Japan, even as it died in Korea. The Japanese connection to Baekje was particularly strong because of long-standing cultural and political ties between the two regions. Baekje had been instrumental in introducing Buddhism to Japan, and many Japanese noble families claimed Baekje ancestry. The fall of Baekje was therefore seen in Japan not just as a foreign political event, but as a family tragedy. With Baekje eliminated, the Tang-Silla Alliance turned its attention to Goguryeo. But Goguryeo, despite being weakened by decades of warfare, was not going to go quietly into the night. The kingdom that had successfully resisted Chinese invasions for centuries was prepared to make one last stand for its independence. The final Goguryeo-Tang War began in 661 CE and lasted for nearly a decade. It was a conflict of unprecedented scale and brutality, involving hundreds of thousands of troops and affecting the entire northeastern region of Asia. The Tang assembled their largest army ever for the campaign, while Goguryeo mobilized every available resource for what they knew would be their final battle for survival. The war was characterized by a series of massive sieges, as the Tang forces systematically attacked Goguryeo's fortress cities. These weren't quick assaults. They were prolonged campaigns that could last for months or even years. The siege of Pyongyang, Goguryeo's capital, lasted for over a year and involved some of the most advanced siege techniques of the ancient world. Goguryeo's resistance was heroic, but ultimately futile. They were facing not just the Tang army, but also Silla forces attacking from the south. It was like fighting a war on two fronts, while already exhausted from previous conflicts. Even the most skilled and determined defenders couldn't overcome such overwhelming odds indefinitely. The end came in 676 CE, when the last Goguryeo fortress finally fell to the combined Tang-Silla assault. King Baekje, the last king of Goguryeo, was captured and taken to China, joining the former king of Baekje in exile. The kingdom that had once controlled territory from Korea to Manchuria was no more. But here's where the story takes another dramatic turn. With Goguryeo and Baekje eliminated, the Tang dynasty expected to assume direct control over the entire Korean peninsula. They had, after all, done most of the heavy lifting in the conquest, and they saw no reason why their junior partner should control the fruits of victory. Silla, however, had different ideas. They had allied with Tang China to survive, not to become a Chinese province. Now that their Korean rivals were eliminated, they were ready to assert their independence and claim control over the entire peninsula for themselves. What followed was one of the most audacious moves in Korean history. Silla, having used Tang China to eliminate their Korean rivals, now turned against their former ally and demanded the Chinese forces withdraw from the peninsula. It was like asking your big brother to help you beat up the neighborhood bullies, then telling him to get out of your room once the fight was over. The Tang response was predictably outraged. From their perspective, they had done Silla an enormous favor by helping them eliminate Goguryeo and Baekje, and now Silla was showing the most appalling ingratitude by demanding Chinese withdrawal. It was like helping someone move their furniture and then being asked to leave before the pizza arrives. Emperor Gaozong and his advisors were genuinely shocked by Silla's audacity. They had assumed that Silla understood their place in the new order as a grateful client state under Chinese protection. The idea that this small Korean kingdom would dare to challenge the mighty Tang Empire seemed almost incomprehensible. But Silla's leadership, particularly King Munmu and General Kim Yu-sin, had been planning this moment for years. They understood that their alliance with Tang had been a temporary necessity, not a permanent arrangement. They had used the alliance to eliminate their Korean rivals, but they had never intended to trade Korean independence for Chinese domination. The Silla strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. They had spent the years of the alliance carefully studying Tang military tactics, learning Chinese strengths and weaknesses, and preparing for the inevitable confrontation. They had also been quietly building support among the former subjects of Goguryeo and Balhae, presenting themselves not as conquerors, but as liberators who would restore Korean independence. The Silla-Tang War began in 676 CE, just as the conquest of Goguryeo was being completed. It was a conflict that would determine whether Korea would become a Chinese province or remain an independent kingdom. The stakes couldn't have been higher, and both sides understood that this was a fight to the finish. The war began with a series of Silla attacks on Tang garrisons throughout the peninsula. These weren't random assaults. They were carefully coordinated operations designed to isolate Chinese forces and prevent them from supporting each other. Silla had learned from their former enemies' mistakes and was determined not to give the Tang the opportunity to concentrate their superior numbers. The Tang response was swift and massive. They assembled another enormous army and launched what they intended to be a decisive campaign to crush Silla once and for all. But they quickly discovered that fighting Silla was very different from fighting Goguryeo or Baekje. Silla had the advantage of fighting on home territory with popular support, while the Tang forces were operating far from their bases with increasingly hostile local populations. The Battle of Maso Fortress in 675 CE became a turning point in the conflict. A Tang army of over 20,000 troops was completely destroyed by Silla forces using tactics that combined traditional Korean military skills with lessons learned from years of observing Chinese methods. It was a devastating defeat that sent shockwaves through the Tang court and demonstrated that Silla was a far more formidable opponent than anyone had expected. General Kim Il-sung, who led many of these victories, became a legendary figure in Korean history. He was one of those rare military commanders who combined tactical brilliance with strategic vision and personal charisma. His troops would follow him anywhere, and his enemies learned to fear the sight of his battle standards. He was like the ancient Korean equivalent of Napoleon, except he never made the mistake of invading Russia in winter. Kim Il-sung's background was as remarkable as his military achievements. He came from the Goryeo region that had been absorbed by Silla, and his rise through the Silla hierarchy demonstrated the kingdom's ability to integrate and utilize talent from across the peninsula. He was living proof that Silla's vision of Korean unification could work in practice, not just in theory. The war continued for several years, with neither side able to achieve a decisive victory. The Tang had superior numbers and resources, but Silla had the advantages of local knowledge, popular support, and shorter supply lines. It was like a heavyweight boxer fighting a lightweight in a lightweight's hometown. The heavyweight might be stronger, but the lightweight knew all the local tricks. The turning point came when the Tang dynasty began to face serious problems elsewhere in their empire. Rebellions in Central Asia, conflicts with Tibet, and internal political struggles meant that they could no longer afford to maintain large armies in Korea indefinitely. The Korean campaign, which had initially seemed like a quick way to expand Chinese territory, had become a costly drain on imperial resources. In 676 CE, the Tang dynasty finally agreed to withdraw their forces from the Korean peninsula in exchange for Silla's acknowledgement of Chinese suzerainty, a face-saving formula that allowed both sides to claim victory. The Chinese could say that Korea remained under their influence, while Silla could celebrate the achievement of practical independence. The withdrawal of Chinese forces marked the beginning of the unified Silla period, the first time in Korean history that the entire peninsula was controlled by a single Korean kingdom. It was a moment of tremendous historical significance, comparable to the unification of Germany or Italy in the 19th century, except it happened over 1,000 years earlier and involved considerably more sword fighting. The unification of Korea under Silla rule ushered in what many historians consider the golden age of ancient Korean civilization. For the first time in centuries, the peninsula was at peace, unified under a single government that could focus on internal development rather than constant warfare with neighboring kingdoms. The achievement was remarkable by any standard. Silla had started as the smallest and seemingly weakest of the three kingdoms. Yet through a combination of strategic patience, diplomatic skill, and military prowess, they had managed to outlast and ultimately absorb their larger rivals. It was like watching the smallest kid in the class become student body president through a combination of intelligence, determination, and knowing when to make the right alliances. King Munmu, who had led Silla through the Unification Wars, became known as one of the greatest rulers in Korean history. His vision of a unified Korea wasn't just about political control. It was about creating a new kind of Korean identity that could incorporate the best elements of all three kingdoms' traditions. The process of unification wasn't just military. It was also cultural and administrative. Silla had to figure out how to govern territories that had been independent for centuries, how to integrate populations with different traditions and loyalties, and how to create a unified Korean identity from the diverse elements of the three kingdoms. The solution was characteristically Silla. They created a synthesis that preserved the best elements of each kingdom's traditions while establishing clear Silla dominance. Former Goguryeo and Baekje nobles were incorporated into the Silla hierarchy, but at levels that ensured Silla control. Local customs were preserved where possible, but within a framework of Silla law and administration. The capital city of Jeongju became one of the great cities of East Asia during this period. With a population that may have reached nearly 1 million people, it was larger than most European cities of the time and rivaled Chang'an and Constantinople in its magnificence. The city was laid out according to Chinese urban planning principles, but adapted to Korean conditions and preferences. Jeongju wasn't just a political capital. It was a cultural and religious center that attracted scholars, artists, and pilgrims from across East Asia. The city's Buddhist temples were architectural marvels that combined Korean, Chinese, and Indian influences in unique and beautiful ways. The famous Goksa Temple, completed during this period, was designed as a representation of the Buddhist paradise on earth, with every element carefully planned to create a sense of spiritual harmony and transcendence. The Seok Grotto, carved into a mountainside overlooking the East Sea, housed a granite Buddha statue that is still considered one of the masterpieces of Buddhist art. The technical achievement involved in creating this grotto was extraordinary. The builders had to understand not just sculpture and architecture, but also geology, hydrology, and astronomy to create a structure that would remain stable and dry for centuries. But unified Silla's achievements weren't limited to religious architecture. The kingdom developed a sophisticated system of education that produced some of the finest scholars in East Asia. National Confucian Academy in Jeongju attracted students from across the region, and Silla scholars were sought after by courts in China and Japan. The Silla educational system was remarkably advanced for its time. It combined Confucian classical learning with Buddhist philosophy, practical administration, and even scientific subjects like astronomy and mathematics. Students were expected to master not just academic subjects, but also poetry, music, and martial arts. It was like a medieval liberal arts education, except with more emphasis on sword fighting and less on Latin. The kingdom also developed a sophisticated legal system that combined traditional Korean customs with Chinese legal principles and Buddhist ethical teachings. The Silla legal code was one of the most advanced in East Asia, providing detailed regulations for everything from commercial transactions to family relationships to criminal justice. Trade flourished during the unified Silla period as never before. With the peninsula at peace and under unified administration, merchants could travel safely from one end of Korea to the other. Silla traders established commercial networks that stretched from Japan to Central Asia, carrying Korean goods to distant markets and bringing foreign luxuries back to Korea. The famous Silla gold crowns, with their intricate designs and precious stones, demonstrate the kingdom's wealth and artistic sophistication during this period. These weren't just symbols of royal power. They were masterpieces of metalworking that required techniques and materials from across the known world. Creating one of these crowns was like assembling a medieval luxury car. It required the finest materials, the most skilled craftsmen, and access to international supply chains. Korean Buddhism reached its highest development during the unified Silla period. The kingdom's monks weren't just religious practitioners. They were scholars, artists, diplomats, and teachers who played crucial roles in Korean society. Many of the most important Buddhist temples and monasteries in Korea were founded during this period, and Korean Buddhist philosophy developed distinctive characteristics that influenced religious thought throughout East Asia. The monk Goryeo, who lived during the early unified Silla period, became one of the most influential Buddhist philosophers in East Asian history. His writings on Buddhist doctrine were studied in China, Japan, and throughout the Buddhist world. He was particularly known for his ability to synthesize different schools of Buddhist thought and his emphasis on making Buddhist teachings accessible to ordinary people. Goryeo's life story reads like something out of a spiritual adventure novel. He traveled extensively throughout Korea and China, engaged in philosophical debates with the greatest scholars of his time, and wrote over 100 works on Buddhist philosophy. He was also known for his unconventional behavior. He deliberately broke monastic rules to demonstrate that true enlightenment transcended formal religious observances. It was like having a medieval Buddhist rock star, except instead of guitar solos, he delivered profound philosophical insights. The cultural achievements of unified Silla extended far beyond religion and philosophy. This was a period of extraordinary artistic and literary creativity that produced works of lasting beauty and significance. The kingdom's artists and writers weren't just copying Chinese or Indian models. They were creating distinctively Korean forms of expression that reflected the unique character of their unified nation. Silla poetry, particularly the Hyanga form, reached new heights of sophistication during this period. These poems, written in a unique system that used Chinese characters to represent Korean sounds and grammar, dealt with themes of love, loss, spiritual devotion, and the beauty of the natural world. Reading them today is like overhearing conversations between ancient Korean poets and their muses, intimate, profound, and surprisingly modern in their emotional directness. The Song of Choyong, one of the most famous Hyanga poems, tells the story of a supernatural being who discovers his wife with another man, but responds with forgiveness and understanding rather than anger. It's a remarkably sophisticated work that operates on multiple levels as a narrative poem, a spiritual allegory, and a meditation on the nature of jealousy and forgiveness. The fact that it was written over 1,000 years ago makes its psychological insight all the more remarkable. Silla visual arts also flourished during this period. The kingdom's sculptors, painters, and metalworkers created works that combined technical mastery with spiritual depth and aesthetic beauty. The famous Silla Buddhist sculptures aren't just religious artifacts. They're works of art that can move viewers to tears with their serene beauty and spiritual power. The Silla approach to art was distinctive in its emphasis on harmony and balance. Whether they were creating a Buddhist statue, a royal crown, or a simple piece of pottery, Silla artists sought to achieve a perfect balance between form and function, beauty and meaning, tradition and innovation. It was like having an entire kingdom of artists who had internalized the principles of good design centuries before anyone had invented design schools. The kingdom's craftsmen were particularly renowned for their work in gold and silver. Silla goldsmiths created jewelry, ceremonial objects, and decorative items that were sought after throughout East Asia. Their techniques were so advanced that modern jewelers still study Silla artifacts to understand how they achieved certain effects. The famous Silla gold belt ornaments, with their intricate filigree work and precious stone inlays, demonstrate a level of technical skill that seems almost impossible for the time period. Creating these pieces required not just artistic vision, but also advanced knowledge of metallurgy, chemistry, and engineering. It was like having medieval craftsmen could work with the precision of modern machines, except they were doing it all by hand with tools that would seem primitive by today's standards. Music and dance also flourished during the unified Silla period. The kingdom developed distinctive musical forms that combined Korean folk traditions with Chinese court music and Buddhist ceremonial music. Silla court performances were renowned throughout East Asia for their elegance and sophistication. The famous Cheoyangmu dance, based on the Choyang legend, became one of the most important traditional Korean performing arts. The dance tells the story of the supernatural being Choyong through movement, music, and elaborate costumes. Watching a performance is like seeing ancient Korean mythology come to life. It's simultaneously entertaining and spiritually moving. Silla musicians developed new instruments and musical techniques that influenced musical development throughout the region. The Goguryeo, a traditional Korean string instrument, reached its classical form during this period and became one of the most important instruments in Korean traditional music. Learning to play the Goguryeo was considered an essential part of a cultured person's education, like learning to play the piano in 19th century Europe. But even golden ages must come to an end, and by the 8th century, unified Silla was beginning to show signs of the internal problems that would eventually lead to its downfall. The very success of the kingdom created new challenges that proved increasingly difficult to manage. The bone rank system, which had provided stability and clear hierarchies during Silla's rise to power, became increasingly rigid and dysfunctional as the kingdom grew larger and more complex. The system that had worked well for a small, homogeneous kingdom proved inadequate for governing a large, diverse nation with territories that had previously belonged to different kingdoms with different traditions. The problem was particularly acute in the former Goguryeo territories in the north. The people of this region had a strong military tradition and a proud history of independence that made them resistant to Silla rule. They had been conquered, not converted, and they never fully accepted their incorporation into the Silla kingdom. The Silla response to this challenge was characteristically systematic, but ultimately counterproductive. They attempted to impose their bone rank system on the entire peninsula, which meant that former Goguryeo and Baekje nobles found themselves relegated to lower positions than they had held in their original kingdoms. It was like being demoted at work after a corporate merger technically legal, but guaranteed to create resentment and resistance. The economic costs of maintaining unified control over the peninsula also proved to be enormous. Silla had to maintain large armies to control their expanded territories, build and staff administrative centers throughout the kingdom, and fund the elaborate court culture that was expected of a major East Asian power. The kingdom's resources, while substantial, were not unlimited, and the financial strain began to show by the 8th century. The problem was compounded by the fact that Silla's expansion had brought them into contact with new enemies and challenges. The northern borders of the former Goguryeo territories were constantly threatened by various nomadic peoples and by the emerging kingdom of Balhae, which was founded by former Goguryeo nobles and claimed to be the legitimate successor to the Goguryeo kingdom. Balhae was particularly problematic for Silla because it represented everything that Silla's unification was supposed to have eliminated: a rival Korean kingdom with legitimate claims to Korean territory and identity. The existence of Balhae meant that Silla's claim to represent all Koreans was contested, and it provided a rallying point for those who opposed Silla rule. The Balhae kingdom, established in 698 CE by Dae-Jo-Yang, a former Goguryeo general, controlled territory in what is now northeastern China and northern Korea. It was like having a rival Korean government in exile, except this government controlled significant territory and had its own army. For Silla, it was a constant reminder that their unification was incomplete and potentially temporary. The relationship between Silla and Balhae was complex and often hostile. Both kingdoms claimed to be the legitimate heir to Korean tradition. Both sought recognition from China as the primary Korean state, and both competed for influence over the various peoples and territories of the region. It was like having two rival claimants to a throne, each with their own supporters and their own version of legitimacy. Internal problems within Silla also began to multiply during the 8th and 9th centuries. The bone rank system, which had provided stability for centuries, began to break down as the kingdom became more complex and diverse. The rigid social hierarchy that had worked for a small, homogeneous kingdom proved inadequate for governing a large, multicultural nation. The problem was particularly acute among the lower ranks of the nobility, who found their opportunities for advancement blocked by the rigid requirements of the bone rank system. Talented individuals from the former Goguryeo and Baekje territories, or even from lower-ranking Silla families, found themselves permanently excluded from the highest positions regardless of their abilities or achievements. It was like having a company where promotions were based entirely on family background rather than performance. Eventually, the most talented people start looking for opportunities elsewhere. The Buddhist establishment, which had been a source of strength and unity during Silla's rise, also began to show signs of corruption and complacency. Many monasteries had become enormously wealthy through royal patronage and land grants, and some monks seemed more interested in worldly pleasures than spiritual development. It was the kind of religious decline that tends to happen when institutions become too comfortable and lose sight of their original mission. The problem wasn't that Buddhism itself was corrupt, but that the close relationship between the Buddhist establishment and the Silla state had created opportunities for abuse. Monasteries controlled vast estates worked by thousands of serfs, engaged in commercial activities, and wielded significant political influence. Some monks lived in luxury that would have made secular nobles envious, which rather defeated the point of monastic poverty. Popular resentment against both the rigid social system and the wealthy Buddhist establishment began to grow during the 9th century. Peasant rebellions became increasingly common, and even some members of the nobility began to question whether the Silla system was still serving the kingdom's interests. The most serious challenge came from a series of regional strongmen who began to assert their independence from central control. These weren't random rebels. They were often members of the Silla nobility who had concluded that the kingdom's central government was too weak and corrupt to deserve their loyalty. The rebellion of Jian in the southwest was particularly significant. Jian was a former Silla general who declared himself king of a revived Baekje kingdom in 892 CE. His rebellion wasn't just a military challenge. It was a direct attack on Silla's legitimacy and their claim to represent all Koreans. Jian revival of the Baekje name was a brilliant propaganda move. It appealed to regional pride and historical memory, while positioning his rebellion as a restoration rather than a revolution. He wasn't just another ambitious general seeking power. He was the liberator of Baekje, fighting to restore the independence that Silla had stolen centuries earlier. At roughly the same time, another rebel leader named Gong established a kingdom in the north that he initially called Taibong, later changing the name to Majin, and finally to Taibong again. Gong claimed to be a Buddhist messiah and attracted followers through a combination of religious charisma and promises of social reform. Gong was one of those historical figures who seemed too strange to be real. He claimed to have supernatural powers, including the ability to read minds and see into the future. He also claimed to be the reincarnation of Maitreya, the future Buddha, which was either a sign of genuine religious conviction or a very creative approach to political legitimacy. Whether or not Gong actually believed his own claims, his movement attracted significant support from people who were dissatisfied with Silla rule. His promises of social reform and religious renewal appealed to those who felt excluded from the benefits of Silla civilization. By the early 10th century, the Korean peninsula was once again divided into multiple kingdoms, just as it had been before Silla's unification. The period became known as the later Three Kingdoms, though the comparison to the original Three Kingdoms period was somewhat misleading, The new kingdoms were different in character and had different relationships with each other and with the outside world. The later Three Kingdoms period was shorter and more chaotic than the original Three Kingdoms era. The new kingdoms lacked the stability and cultural development of their predecessors, and the period was marked by almost constant warfare and political instability. Silla, now reduced to the southeastern part of the peninsula, struggled to maintain control even over its remaining territory. The kingdom that had once unified Korea was now just one of several competing powers, and not necessarily the strongest one. Later Baekje, under Jeon Hwan, controlled much of the southwestern peninsula and proved to be a formidable military power. Jeon Hwan was an effective general and administrator who managed to create a functioning kingdom from the chaos of Silla's collapse. Taebong, under Gongdi, controlled the northern and central parts of the peninsula, including the important Han River Valley. Despite Gongyi's eccentric religious claims, his kingdom was well organized and militarily effective. But the most significant development of this period was the rise of a new leader who would eventually reunify the Yesi Peninsula and establish a dynasty that would last for nearly 500 years. Wang Jian, originally one of Gongyi's generals, would overthrow his master and establish the Goryeo kingdom that would give Korea its modern name. Wang Jian's rise to power reads like a political thriller. He was a member of a wealthy merchant family from the Songguk region, modern-day Kaesong, who had initially supported Gongyi's rebellion against Silla. But as Gongdi became increasingly erratic and tyrannical, Wang Jian began to attract support from those who wanted change without religious fanaticism. The turning point came when Gongdi began to claim that he could read people's thoughts and started executing officials based on his supposed psychic insights. This was the kind of leadership style that tends to make subordinates nervous, and Wang Jian found himself with plenty of supporters when he decided to stage a coup in 918 CE. Wang Jian's overthrow of Gongdi was swift and decisive. Unlike many military coups, it was also relatively bloodless, which suggested that Wang Jian understood the importance of maintaining legitimacy and avoiding unnecessary enemies. He immediately declared the establishment of the Goryeo kingdom and began the process of reunifying the peninsula. The name Goryeo was significant. It was a shortened form of Goguryeo, which suggested that Wang Jian saw himself as the heir to the great northern kingdom rather than to Silla. Was a clever political move that appealed to former Goguryeo territories, while also distinguishing his kingdom from the discredited Silla regime. Wang Jian's approach to reunification was different from Silla's earlier strategy. Rather than relying primarily on military conquest, he emphasized diplomacy, marriage alliances, and the gradual absorption of rival kingdoms through negotiation and incentives. It was conquest with a velvet glove, and it proved to be remarkably effective. The process took several decades, but by 935 CE, Wang Jian had managed to convince the last Silla king to abdicate peacefully and transfer his authority to Goryeo. It was an extraordinary achievement. The kingdom that had once conquered all of Korea voluntarily surrendered to its successor without a final battle. The peaceful absorption of Silla was followed by the conquest of later Baekje in 936 CE, which was more violent but still relatively brief. Jeon Hwan, the founder of later Baekje, had been overthrown by his own son, and the kingdom was weakened by internal conflicts that made it vulnerable to Goryeo attack. With the elimination of the last rival kingdom, Wang Jian had achieved what seemed impossible just a few decades earlier, the reunification of Korea under a new dynasty. The Goryeo kingdom would go on to rule Korea for nearly 500 years, making it one of the longest-lasting dynasties in Korean history. As we reach the end of our journey through the Three Kingdoms period, it's worth reflecting on what this extraordinary era meant for Korea and for world history. The period from 57 BCE to 935 CE, nearly 1,000 years, saw the transformation of the Korean peninsula from a collection of tribal societies into a unified, sophisticated civilization that would influence East Asian culture for centuries to come. The Three Kingdoms period established many of the fundamental characteristics of Korean civilization. The emphasis on education and scholarship, the synthesis of indigenous traditions with foreign influences, the importance of Buddhism and Confucianism in Korean culture, and the ideal of national unity all have their roots in this period. Each of the three kingdoms contributed something essential to the Korean identity that emerged from their conflicts and eventual unification. Goguryeo provided the martial spirit and the ideal of resistance to foreign domination. Their successful defense against Chinese invasions became a source of national pride that would inspire Korean resistance movements for centuries to come. Baekje contributed the ideals of cultural sophistication and international engagement. Their achievements in art, architecture, and diplomacy demonstrated that Korea could compete with any civilization in the world in terms of cultural development. The Baekje legacy lived on not just in Korea, but also in Japan, where Baekje refugees and their descendants played crucial roles in Japanese cultural development. Silla provided the model of successful unification and the demonstration that Korean kingdoms could overcome their divisions to create something greater than the sum of their parts. The Silla achievement of unifying the peninsula while maintaining independence from Chinese domination became the template for later Korean dynasties. The Three Kingdoms period also established Korea's position in the broader East Asian cultural sphere. Korean Buddhism, Korean Confucianism, and Korean approaches to art and literature all developed their distinctive characteristics during this period. Korea wasn't just a passive recipient of Chinese cultural influence. It was an active participant in East Asian civilization that made its own unique contributions. The period's influence extended far beyond Korea's borders. Korean monks, scholars, and artisans traveled throughout East Asia, spreading Korean innovations and ideas. The Korean writing system that developed during this period influenced the development of writing systems in other parts of East Asia. Korean architectural and artistic styles were copied and adapted in China and Japan. Perhaps most importantly, the Three Kingdoms period established the ideal of Korean unity that would inspire later generations. Even when Korea was divided or under foreign rule, the memory of the unified Silla kingdom provided a vision of what Korea could become when its people worked together rather than against each other. The period also demonstrated the importance of strategic thinking and long-term planning in politics and warfare. Silla's eventual victory wasn't the result of superior military strength or natural resources. It was the result of better strategy, more effective diplomacy, and a clearer vision of the future. The Silla leadership understood that sometimes you have to make difficult short-term compromises to achieve long-term goals. The Three Kingdoms period showed that small nations could survive and thrive in a world dominated by larger powers, but only through intelligence, determination, and the willingness to adapt to changing circumstances. The Korean kingdom's success in maintaining their independence while engaging with Chinese civilization provided a model for other small nations facing similar challenges. As our story draws to a close, it's worth reflecting on what the Three Kingdoms period tells us about human nature and the eternal challenges of political life. The kings, generals, monks, and ordinary people who lived through this extraordinary period faced many of the same fundamental questions that we face today. How do we balance individual ambition with collective welfare? How do we maintain our identity while adapting to a changing world? How do we build institutions that can survive the test of time? The Three Kingdoms period provides no easy answers to these questions, but it does offer some insights. The kingdoms that survived and thrived were those that managed to combine stability with adaptability, tradition with innovation, and local identity with international engagement. They understood that success required not just military strength or economic resources, but also cultural vitality and moral legitimacy. The period also demonstrates the importance of leadership in shaping historical outcomes. The great kings and generals of the Three Kingdoms period, Gwanggaeto the Great, King Seong, King Munmu, Kim Yu-sin, and Wang Jian, were all individuals who combined personal ability with a clear vision of what they wanted to achieve. They understood that leadership isn't just about giving orders. It's about inspiring others to work toward a common goal. But the period also shows the limitations of individual leadership. Even the greatest leaders were constrained by the circumstances of their time and the institutions they inherited. The decline of unified Silla wasn't the result of poor leadership alone. It was also the result of structural problems that no individual leader could have solved. The Three Kingdoms period reminds us that history is made by ordinary people, as well as by kings and generals. The farmers who grew the food that fed the armies, the craftsmen who created the weapons and tools, the merchants who maintained the trade networks, and the scholars who preserved and transmitted knowledge, all played crucial roles in shaping the course of events. The period also demonstrates the complex relationship between war and culture. The constant conflicts between the kingdoms were destructive and costly, but they also stimulated innovation and cultural development. The need to compete with rivals encouraged each kingdom to develop its distinctive strengths and to strive for excellence in all areas of human endeavor. Perhaps most importantly, the Three Kingdoms period shows us that even in the most difficult circumstances, human beings are capable of creating beauty, meaning, and lasting value. The art, literature, and architecture that survive from this period continue to move and inspire people more than 1,000 years after their creation. The Buddhist temples, the royal tombs, the poetry, and the historical records all testified to the human capacity for transcendence, even in the midst of political chaos and military conflict. As we conclude our journey through the Three Kingdoms period, it's important to remember that this story doesn't really end with the establishment of Goryeo in 935 CE. The themes and patterns established during the Three Kingdoms period would continue to influence Korean history for centuries to come. The ideal of national unity established by Silla would inspire later Korean dynasties and independence movements. The cultural achievements of the Three Kingdoms would provide the foundation for later Korean cultural development. The strategic lessons learned during this period would influence Korean approaches to international relations for generations. The Three Kingdoms period also established Korea's distinctive approach to dealing with larger, more powerful neighbors. The Korean strategy of maintaining independence through a combination of military resistance, diplomatic skill, and cultural adaptation would be tested repeatedly in later centuries, but it would prove remarkably durable. The period's influence can be seen in modern Korea as well. The division of Korea into North and South after World War II echoed the ancient divisions of the Three Kingdoms period, and the dream of reunification draws on the same ideals of national unity that inspired the ancient kingdoms. The cultural achievements of the Three Kingdoms period continue to influence Korean art, literature, and architecture today. Modern Korean artists and writers still draw inspiration from the themes and styles developed during this ancient period. And Korean cultural exports, like K-pop and Korean dramas, often incorporate elements that can be traced back to the Three Kingdoms era. The Three Kingdoms period also provides lessons that are relevant beyond Korea. In our modern world of globalization and cultural exchange, the Korean experience of maintaining cultural identity while engaging with foreign influences offers valuable insights. The Korean approach of selective adaptation, taking what is useful from foreign cultures while preserving what is essential in one's own tradition, remains relevant in our interconnected world. The period's demonstration that small nations can survive and thrive through intelligence, determination, and strategic thinking continues to inspire countries around the world that face similar challenges. The Korean kingdom's success in maintaining their independence while participating in the broader East Asian cultural sphere provides a model for how nations can engage with globalization while preserving their distinctive identities. And so our tale comes to an end, though like all great stories, it continues to resonate long after the final words are spoken. The Three Kingdoms period was more than just a chapter in Korean history. It was a foundational era that established many of the characteristics that would define Korean civilization for centuries to come. The period gave us stories of heroic resistance and brilliant strategy, of cultural achievement and artistic beauty, of human ambition and divine inspiration. It showed us kingdoms that rose and fell, alliances that formed and dissolved, and individuals who shaped the course of history through their courage, wisdom, and determination. But perhaps most importantly, the Three Kingdoms period gave us a vision of what human societies can achieve when they combine respect for tradition with openness to innovation, when they balance individual ambition with collective welfare, and when they refuse to accept that might makes right. The kingdoms of Goguryeo, Baekje, and Silla are gone now, their palaces reduced to archaeological sites, and their armies to museum displays. But their legacy lives on in the culture, values, and aspirations of the Korean people, and their story continues to inspire all those who believe that small nations can achieve great things and that human beings are capable of creating beauty and meaning, even in the most challenging circumstances. In the end, the Three Kingdoms period reminds us that history is not just about the rise and fall of political entities, but about the eternal human struggle to create societies that are just, prosperous, and culturally vibrant. It's a struggle that continues today, and the lessons learned by the ancient Korean kingdoms remain as relevant now as they were over 1,000 years ago. The dance of the Three Kingdoms has ended, but the music plays on, and new dancers continue to take the stage. The story of Korea didn't end with the Three Kingdoms period. It was just beginning. And in that continuation, and that endless human effort to build something better than what came before, we can find both inspiration and hope for our own times and our own challenges. As the morning mist rises from the ancient mountains of Korea, carrying with it the whispers of long-dead kings and the dreams of unborn generations, we can still hear the echo of that eternal dance, a dance of ambition and wisdom, of conflict and cooperation, of tradition and innovation that defines not just Korean history, but the human experience itself. And perhaps that's the most important lesson of all, that we are all participants in this great dance of history, each of us playing our part in the eternal story of human civilization, just as the kings and peasants, monks and warriors, artists and scholars of the Three Kingdoms period played theirs. In the quiet moments between the grand battles and political machinations, life in the Three Kingdoms continued with a rhythm as old as humanity itself. Children were born and grew to adulthood, farmers tended their rice paddies through the changing seasons, and lovers met under the same moon that had witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties. The common people of the Three Kingdoms period lived lives that were simultaneously shaped by the great events of their time, and remarkably similar to human lives in any era. They worried about their families, celebrated their harvests, mourned their losses, and dreamed of better futures for their children. They were the true foundation upon which the kingdoms rested, though their names are largely lost to history. A farmer in Goguryeo territory might spend his days working fields that had been battlegrounds just years before, finding arrowheads and broken weapons among the rice stalks. Yet he would also find time to teach his son the ancient songs of his people, to participate in village festivals that connected him to traditions stretching back centuries, and to marvel at the beauty of the changing seasons in the mountains that surrounded his home. A merchant's daughter in Baekje might grow up surrounded by silk from China, spices from Southeast Asia, and stories of distant lands brought by traders who visited her father's shop. She would learn to read and write, perhaps even compose poetry, and she would understand that her small kingdom was part of a vast, interconnected world that stretched far beyond the horizons she could see. A young monk in Silla might spend his days copying Buddhist sutras, tending the monastery garden, and contemplating the nature of existence. But he would also serve as a teacher for local children, a counselor for troubled villagers, and a keeper of knowledge that would be passed down through generations. His quiet devotion would be as important to his kingdom's survival as any general's military victories. These ordinary lives lived with dignity and purpose, despite the uncertainties of their times, remind us that history is not just about kings and battles, but about the countless individual choices and small acts of courage that shape the world. The Three Kingdoms period was as much about the farmer who chose to plant his crops despite the threat of war, the merchant who maintained honest dealings despite the temptation to cheat, and the monk who preserved knowledge despite the chaos around him, as it was about the famous rulers whose names we remember. The Three Kingdoms period spanned nearly a millennium, long enough for dozens of generations to be born, live their lives, and pass into memory. During this vast sweep of time, the peninsula experienced changes that were both dramatic and subtle, revolutionary and evolutionary. The physical landscape itself was transformed during this period. Forests were cleared for agriculture, cities were built and rebuilt, roads were constructed to connect distant regions, and temples and palaces rose to mark the achievements of each generation. The Korea of 935 CE was a very different place from the Korea of 57 BCE, not just politically, but physically and culturally as well. The introduction of Buddhism in the 4th century was perhaps the most profound cultural change of the entire period. This wasn't just the adoption of a new religion. It was the introduction of a completely different way of understanding the world and humanity's place in it. Buddhism brought with it new forms of art and architecture, new approaches to education and scholarship, and new ideals of personal conduct and social organization. The Buddhist transformation of Korean culture was gradual but thorough. Buddhist temples became centers of learning and culture. Buddhist festivals became part of the rhythm of Korean life, and Buddhist concepts of compassion and enlightenment influenced Korean approaches to governance and social relations. By the end of the Three Kingdoms period, Buddhism had become so thoroughly integrated into Korean culture that it was difficult to imagine Korea without it. Yet Buddhism didn't simply replace traditional Korean beliefs and practices. It merged with them to create something new and distinctively Korean. Korean Buddhism incorporated elements of shamanism, ancestor worship, and folk religion that gave it a character different from Buddhism in other countries. It was a perfect example of how Korean culture has always been able to absorb foreign influences while maintaining its own distinctive identity. The development of Korean writing systems during this period was another transformation of enormous significance. The adaptation of Chinese characters to represent Korean sounds and grammar allowed Korean literature, philosophy, and historical records to flourish in ways that would have been impossible with purely oral traditions. The Hyanga poetry of Silla, written in this adapted script, represents one of the earliest examples of Korean literature that we can still read and appreciate today. These poems give us direct access to the thoughts and feelings of people who lived over 1,000 years ago, creating a bridge across time that allows us to understand something of their hopes, fears, and dreams. The physical remains of the Three Kingdoms period continue to inspire wonder and admiration today. The temples, tombs, and fortifications that survive from this era are not just archaeological artifacts. They are testimonies to the human capacity for creating beauty, and meaning that transcends the limitations of time and mortality. The great Buddhist temples of the period were designed as representations of the cosmic order, with every element carefully planned to create a sense of harmony and transcendence. Walking through the ruins of these temples today, even in their damaged state, one can still sense something of the spiritual power they were meant to convey. The Bulguksa Temple in Gyeongju, though much restored over the centuries, still gives visitors a sense of the architectural vision of its original builders. The temple's stone foundations, with their perfectly fitted blocks and elegant proportions, demonstrate a level of technical skill and aesthetic sensitivity that rivals the greatest architectural achievements of any civilization. The royal tombs of the Three Kingdoms period are equally impressive in their own way. These massive earthen mounds, some over 20 meters high, were designed to serve as eternal resting places for the kingdom's rulers. The tomb chambers, constructed of carefully fitted stone blocks, were built to last for millennia, and many have succeeded in their purpose. The contents of these tombs, when they have been excavated, reveal the extraordinary wealth and artistic sophistication of the Three Kingdoms period. Gold crowns of incredible delicacy and complexity, jewelry that demonstrates mastery of advanced metalworking techniques, and pottery that combines functional excellence with aesthetic beauty all testify to the high level of civilization achieved during this period. But perhaps the most moving aspect of these archaeological remains is what they tell us about the people who created them. The care and skill that went into constructing a temple or tomb, the artistic vision that guided the creation of a crown or a piece of pottery, and the spiritual devotion that inspired the carving of a Buddhist statue, all speak to the human desire to create something of lasting value and beauty. The Three Kingdoms period also gave birth to musical and literary traditions that continue to influence Korean culture today. The court music of the period, with its complex rhythms and sophisticated instrumentation, established patterns that can still be heard in traditional Korean music. The Goguryeo-Tang, the traditional Korean string instrument that reached its classical form during this period, produces sounds that seem to capture something essential about the Korean spirit, sometimes melancholy and reflective, sometimes joyful and celebratory, always deeply expressive of human emotion. The stories and legends that emerged from the Three Kingdoms period have become part of the collective memory of the Korean people. The tale of Jumong's founding of Goguryeo, the story of the Hwarung warriors, the legend of Choyong, and countless other narratives from this period continue to be told and retold, each generation finding new meanings and relevance in these ancient stories. These stories serve multiple functions in Korean culture. They are entertainment, certainly, but they are also repositories of cultural values, sources of national identity, and links to a shared past that helps define what it means to be Korean. They remind each generation of Koreans that they are part of a story that began long before they were born and will continue long after they are gone. The historical records of the Three Kingdoms period, particularly the Samguk Sagi, History of the Three Kingdoms, compiled in the 12th century, provide us with detailed accounts of the political and military events of the period. But they also give us glimpses of the daily life, cultural practices, and social values of the time. Reading these historical records today is like having a conversation with people from the distant past. We can sense their pride in their achievements, their concern for their kingdom's welfare, and their hope that their deeds would be remembered by future generations. In preserving and studying these records, we fulfill their hope and maintain our connection to this foundational period of Korean history. One of the most striking aspects of the Three Kingdoms period is how many of its themes and patterns have recurred throughout Korean history. The tension between unity and division, the challenge of maintaining independence while engaging with more powerful neighbors, the importance of cultural achievement alongside political success, all of these themes from the Three Kingdoms period have appeared again and again in later Korean history. The division of Korea after World War II, for example, echoed in some ways the ancient division of the peninsula among competing kingdoms. The dream of reunification that motivates both North and South Korea today draws on the same ideals of national unity that inspired the ancient kingdom's struggles for dominance. The Korean War of the 1950s saw foreign powers intervening in Korean affairs, much as Chinese dynasties had intervened during the Three Kingdoms period. The Korean response fierce resistance, combined with strategic adaptation, followed patterns established over 1,000 years earlier. Modern Korea's approach to economic development and cultural diplomacy also shows the influence of Three Kingdoms period precedents. The emphasis on education and technological innovation, the careful balance between preserving Korean identity and engaging with global culture, and the use of cultural exports to enhance national prestige all have roots in strategies developed during the ancient period. The Korean wave, Hallyu, that has brought Korean popular culture to global audiences in recent decades can be seen as a modern version of the cultural diplomacy practiced by the ancient kingdoms. Just as Baekje art and culture influenced development in China and Japan, Korean dramas, music, and films today are influencing popular culture around the world. What lessons can we draw from this long journey through the Three Kingdoms period? What wisdom can these ancient kingdoms offer to our modern world? First, the period demonstrates the importance of long-term thinking and strategic patience. Silla's eventual victory wasn't the result of superior resources or military strength, but of better strategy and the willingness to wait for the right moment to act. In our age of instant gratification and short-term thinking, this lesson is particularly relevant. Second, the period shows the value of cultural development alongside political and military achievement. The kingdoms that are remembered most fondly today are those that created lasting works of art, literature, and architecture, not just those that won the most battles. Cultural soft power, as we would call it today, proved to be more durable than military hard power. Third, the period illustrates the importance of adaptability and openness to change. The kingdoms that survived and thrived were those that could adapt to new circumstances while maintaining their core identity. They were open to foreign influences, but selective in what they adopted, taking what was useful while preserving what was essential. Fourth, the period demonstrates that small nations can achieve great things through intelligence, determination, and unity of purpose. None of the Korean kingdoms could match the resources of the Chinese Empire, but they could and did achieve independence and cultural greatness through superior strategy and stronger social cohesion. Finally, the period reminds us that history is made by ordinary people as well as by great leaders. The farmers, craftsmen, merchants, and scholars of the Three Kingdoms period were as important to their kingdom's success as the kings and generals whose names we remember. Their quiet dedication to their work and their communities provided the foundation upon which the great achievements of the period rested. As our story reaches its true conclusion, we return to where we began, to the misty mountains and emerald valleys of ancient Korea, where the spirits of the past still whisper their secrets to those who know how to listen. The Three Kingdoms period was more than just a chapter in Korean history. It was a foundational era that established patterns and ideals that continue to influence Korean culture today. It was a time when the Korean people first learned to think of themselves as a unified nation, when they first achieved the delicate balance between preserving their own identity and engaging with the wider world, and when they first demonstrated that small nations could achieve greatness through wisdom, courage, and cultural creativity. The kingdoms of Goguryeo, Baekje, and Silla are gone now, their palaces reduced to ruins, and their armies to museum displays. But their legacy lives on in the values, traditions, and aspirations of the Korean people. Their story continues to inspire all those who believe that human beings are capable of creating societies that are just, prosperous, and culturally vibrant. In the end, the Three Kingdoms period reminds us that we are all part of a great human story that began long before we were born and will continue long after we are gone. Each of us has a role to play in this story, just as the kings and peasants, monks and warriors, artists and scholars of ancient Korea played theirs. The dance of history continues, and we are all dancers in it. The music that guided the steps of the Three Kingdoms still plays, though in new rhythms and with new instruments. The stage has changed, but the fundamental human drama remains the same, the eternal struggle to create meaning, beauty, and justice in a world that is often chaotic and uncertain. As the sun sets over the ancient mountains of Korea, casting long shadows across the valleys where kingdoms once rose and fell, we can still hear the echo of that eternal dance. It calls to us across the centuries, reminding us that we too are part of this great story, that our choices and actions matter, and that the future is ours to shape. The Three Kingdoms period ended over 1,000 years ago, but its spirit lives on. In every act of courage, every work of art, every effort to build something better than what came before, we continue the work that began in those misty mountains so long ago. We are the inheritors of their dreams, the guardians of their legacy, and the authors of the next chapter in the great human story. And so the dance continues, eternal and ever-changing, as beautiful and complex as the human spirit itself. The Three Kingdoms of ancient Korea have taken their final bow, but the music plays on, and new dancers continue to take the stage. In their steps, we can see the reflection of our own hopes and dreams, our own struggles and triumphs, our own small part in the great dance of history. The story of the Three Kingdoms is ended, but the story of Korea and the story of humanity continues. And in that continuation, in that endless human effort to create something beautiful and meaningful from the raw materials of existence, we find both the true legacy of the ancient kingdoms and the hope for our own future. In the gentle morning light that now bathes the Korean peninsula, we can see both the shadows of the past and the promise of the future. The Three Kingdoms have become memory, but memory that lives and breathes and continues to shape the world. Their dance is ended, but the music they created will play forever, calling each new generation to take up the eternal human task of building civilizations, worthy of our highest aspirations and deepest dreams. And perhaps that is the most beautiful lesson of all, that nothing truly great ever dies, but lives on in the hearts and minds of those who come after, inspiring them to dance their own steps in the eternal ballet of human civilization. The Three Kingdoms of Korea have taken their place among the immortal stories of humanity, and their dance will continue as long as there are people to remember their tale and find inspiration in their extraordinary journey from division to unity, from conflict to harmony, from the darkness of ignorance to the light of wisdom and understanding. The curtain falls, but the applause echoes on, and somewhere in the misty mountains of Korea, the spirits of ancient kings and common people alike smile to know that their story has been told, their memory preserved, and their legacy secured for all the generations yet to come. But wait, there are deeper currents in this ancient story that deserve our attention, threads of meaning that weave through the centuries like underground rivers, surfacing in unexpected places and times. The tale of the Three Kingdoms is not merely a historical account. It is a mirror that reflects the eternal human condition, and in its depths, we can discover truths that speak to every generation. In the quiet halls of ancient Korean palaces, where silk rustled against stone and incense burned before golden Buddhas, the rulers of the Three Kingdoms grappled with questions that would challenge political philosophers for millennia to come. What is the nature of legitimate authority? How does one balance the needs of the state against the rights of the individual? When is war justified, and when does the pursuit of power become mere tyranny? King Manmu of Silla, as he contemplated his alliance with Tang China, must have wrestled with these questions through many sleepless nights. The decision to invite foreign armies onto Korean soil to defeat fellow Koreans was not made lightly. It represented a fundamental choice about the nature of Korean identity and the price of survival. Was it better to preserve Korean independence by accepting division, or to achieve unity at the cost of temporary foreign domination? The Silla court's deliberations on this matter, though lost to history in their specific details, must have been among the most profound political discussions of the ancient world. They were essentially debating whether the ends justify the means, whether the goal of Korean unification was important enough to justify collaboration with foreign powers against fellow Koreans. This philosophical dilemma echoes through Korean history like a recurring theme in a complex musical composition. During the Japanese colonial period, Koreans faced similar choices between collaboration and resistance. During the Cold War, The division of Korea again raised questions about the relationship between unity and independence, between ideological purity and practical survival. The Three Kingdoms period established a Korean approach to these eternal questions that emphasized pragmatic flexibility combined with long-term strategic thinking. The Korean kingdoms learned to bend without breaking, to compromise without surrendering their essential identity, and to play the long game even when short-term prospects seemed hopeless. The relationship between religious faith and political power during the Three Kingdoms period was far more complex and nuanced than a simple narrative of Buddhist influence might suggest. Each kingdom developed its own unique synthesis of indigenous shamanic traditions, imported Buddhist philosophy, and Confucian political theory, creating religious political systems that were distinctively Korean while remaining connected to broader East Asian cultural patterns. In Goguryeo, the shamanic tradition remained particularly strong, even after the official adoption of Buddhism. The kingdom's rulers continued to consult shamans for guidance on military campaigns and state policy, while simultaneously patronizing Buddhist temples and Confucian schools. This wasn't seen as contradictory. Rather, it reflected a Korean understanding that different spiritual traditions could offer different kinds of wisdom for different situations. The famous tomb paintings of Goguryeo nobles often show a fascinating mixture of Buddhist, Confucian, and shamanic imagery. A single tomb might contain Buddhist symbols of enlightenment, Confucian representations of proper social relationships, and shamanic depictions of the soul's journey to the afterlife. These weren't competing worldviews, but complementary aspects of a unified Korean spiritual understanding. Baekje's approach to religion was perhaps the most sophisticated of the Three Kingdoms. Their court Buddhism was highly intellectual and philosophical, engaging with the most advanced Buddhist thought of the time. Baekje monks traveled to India and Central Asia to study at the sources of Buddhist learning, and their monasteries became centers of international scholarship that attracted students from across East Asia. Yet Baekje Buddhism never lost touch with the practical needs of ordinary people. Baekje temples served not just as places of worship, but as schools, hospitals, and social service centers. The kingdom's Buddhist establishment understood that spiritual enlightenment was meaningless if it didn't address the real-world suffering of the people. Silla's religious synthesis was perhaps the most enduring of the Three Kingdoms. Their integration of Buddhism with the bone-rank social system created a spiritual hierarchy that paralleled and reinforced the political hierarchy. This wasn't simply a matter of using religion to justify political power. It was a genuine attempt to create a society in which spiritual and temporal authority worked together for the common good. The Hwarang tradition exemplified this Silla synthesis. These young warriors were expected to be equally skilled in martial arts and Buddhist meditation, in Confucian classics and indigenous poetry. They represented an ideal of balanced human development that combined physical prowess, intellectual achievement, and spiritual insight. This religious political synthesis had profound implications for Korean culture that extended far beyond Three Kingdoms period. It established a Korean tradition of viewing political authority as having spiritual dimensions, while simultaneously maintaining that spiritual authority must be grounded in practical wisdom and social responsibility. Behind the grand political narratives and cultural achievements of the Three Kingdoms period lay complex economic systems that made everything else possible. The kingdom's ability to support large armies, build magnificent temples, and maintain sophisticated courts depended on agricultural productivity, craft specialization, and trade networks that were remarkably advanced for their time. The agricultural revolution that occurred during the Three Kingdoms period was as important as any military victory in determining the course of Korean history. The introduction of new rice varieties, improved irrigation techniques, and more efficient farming tools allowed the Korean population to grow dramatically and freed up labor for non-agricultural activities. The terraced rice fields that still characterize much of the Korean landscape were largely created during this period. These weren't just agricultural improvements. They were massive engineering projects that required sophisticated planning, coordinated labor, and long-term investment. The kingdoms that could organize and complete such projects demonstrated a level of administrative capability that rivaled anything in the ancient world. Craft specialization reached extraordinary levels during the Three Kingdoms period. Korean metalworkers developed techniques for creating steel that was superior to anything produced in China or Japan. Korean potters created ceramics that were sought after throughout East Asia. Korean textile workers produced silk and other fabrics that were prized in markets from Central Asia to Southeast Asia. This craft specialization wasn't just about creating luxury goods for the elite. It was about developing the technological base that made Korean civilization possible. The same metalworking techniques that created beautiful gold crowns also produced the weapons and tools that defended and built the kingdoms. The same ceramic techniques that created elegant pottery also produced the roof tiles and drainage systems that made Korean cities possible. Trade networks during the Three Kingdoms period were far more extensive and sophisticated than many people realize. Korean merchants traveled regularly to China, Japan, and Southeast Asia, carrying Korean goods to foreign markets and bringing back foreign products, ideas, and technologies. These weren't just commercial relationships. They were cultural exchanges that enriched Korean civilization and spread Korean influence throughout the region. The famous Silk Road, which connected East Asia with Central Asia and ultimately with Europe, had Korean branches that brought Korean goods to markets as far away as Persia and Byzantium. Korean silk, metalwork, and pottery have been found in archaeological sites throughout Eurasia, testifying to the global reach of Korean commerce during this period. This economic foundation was crucial to the kingdom's political and military success. Goguryeo-Tang's ability to resist Chinese invasions depended not just on military skill, but on the economic resources to support large armies over extended periods. Baekje's cultural achievements were possible because of the wealth generated by their extensive trade networks. Silla's eventual unification of the peninsula was facilitated by their control of key trade routes and their ability to finance long military campaigns. The Three Kingdoms period was also an era of remarkable technological innovation that had profound implications for Korean society and culture. Korean engineers and craftsmen developed new techniques in metallurgy, architecture, agriculture, and military technology that gave their kingdom significant advantages over their rivals. Korean fortress construction during this period was particularly advanced. The mountain fortresses that protected Goguryeo cities were marvels of military engineering that combined natural defensive advantages with sophisticated artificial fortifications. These weren't just walls. They were complex defensive systems that included multiple lines of defense, sophisticated water management systems, and provisions for withstanding extended sieges. The famous Ansi Fortress, which successfully resisted Tang Chinese siege for months, was a masterpiece of defensive architecture. Its walls were designed to deflect siege engines. Its gates were positioned to create killing fields for defenders, and its water supply was protected by underground channels that couldn't be cut by besiegers. The fortress was essentially a medieval military machine designed for one purpose, making it as difficult and costly as possible for enemies to capture it. Korean metallurgy during this period was among the most advanced in the world. Korean smiths developed techniques for creating pattern-welded steel that was both beautiful and functional. Their swords were prized throughout East Asia for their sharpness and durability, and their armor was sought after by warriors from China to Japan. But Korean technological innovation wasn't limited to military applications. Korean architects developed new techniques for constructing large wooden buildings without nails, using complex joinery systems that allowed structures to flex during earthquakes while maintaining their structural integrity. These techniques were so advanced that they influenced architectural development throughout East Asia. Korean agricultural technology also advanced significantly during this period. The development of new plowing techniques, improved seed varieties, and more efficient irrigation systems allowed Korean farmers to produce surplus food that could support larger populations and more complex societies. The Ondol heating system, which used heated floors to warm Korean homes, was a technological innovation that made Korean winters more bearable and allowed for more comfortable living conditions. Perhaps most importantly, Korean innovations in printing and writing technology during this period laid the groundwork for later Korean achievements in these areas. The adaptation of Chinese characters to represent Korean sounds and grammar was a technological breakthrough that made Korean literature possible. Later Korean innovations in printing technology, including the world's first metal movable type, built on foundations laid during the Three Kingdoms period. The psychological dimensions of the Three Kingdoms period are perhaps the most fascinating and least understood aspects of this era. How did people cope with the constant uncertainty of war and political upheaval? What mental strategies did they develop for dealing with the stress of living in a world where kingdoms could rise and fall within a single lifetime? The Buddhist emphasis on impermanence, which became so central to Korean culture during this period, can be understood partly as a psychological response to political instability. If everything is temporary and subject to change, then neither victory nor defeat is permanent. This philosophical perspective provided a framework for understanding and coping with the dramatic reversals of fortune that characterized the period. The Confucian emphasis on proper relationships and social harmony served a similar psychological function. In a world where political authority was constantly contested, the Confucian ideal of stable social relationships provided a sense of order and predictability that helped people navigate uncertain times. The shamanic tradition, with its emphasis on communication with spirits and ancestors, provided another form of psychological support. The belief that the dead continued to watch over and protect the living gave people a sense of continuity and connection that transcended the temporary political arrangements of the moment. The integration of these three traditions' Buddhist acceptance of impermanence, Confucian emphasis on social stability, and shamanic connection to ancestral wisdom created a uniquely Korean approach to psychological resilience that helped the Korean people survive and thrive despite centuries of political upheaval. This psychological framework had practical implications for Korean political and military strategy. Korean leaders learned to think in terms of long-term cycles rather than short-term victories or defeats. They understood that temporary setbacks could be overcome through patience and persistence, and that apparent victories could be reversed if one became overconfident or complacent. The Korean concept of Han, which is often translated as a kind of deep, persistent sorrow or resentment, can be understood partly as a psychological response to the traumas of the Three Kingdoms period. Han isn't just sadness. It's a complex emotional state that combines grief, anger, hope, and determination. It's the emotional residue of historical trauma transformed into a source of strength and resilience. While the historical records of the Three Kingdoms period focus primarily on male rulers and warriors, women played crucial roles in the political, cultural, and economic life of the kingdoms that deserve greater attention and understanding. Queen Silla-Tang of Silla, who ruled from 632 to 647 CE, was one of the most remarkable rulers of the entire period. She came to power at a time when Silla was under severe pressure from both Goguryeo and Baekje, and her reign was marked by significant military and cultural achievements. Under her rule, Silla successfully defended itself against multiple invasions while simultaneously undertaking major construction projects, including the famous Keumseongdae Observatory. Queen Silla-Tang's reign demonstrated that female rulers could be just as effective as male rulers in the brutal world of Three Kingdoms politics. Her success paved the way for other female rulers in Korean history and established a precedent for women's political participation that was unusual in the ancient world. The role of women in the Buddhist establishment was also significant during this period. While Buddhist monasteries were typically segregated by gender, nuns played important roles as teachers, scholars, and spiritual advisors. Some of the most important Buddhist texts and commentaries of the period were written by women, though many of these works have been lost over the centuries. Women also played crucial roles in the economic life of the kingdoms. The textile industry, which was one of the most important sectors of the Korean economy during this period, was largely dominated by women. Korean silk and other textiles were prized throughout East Asia, and the women who produced these goods were skilled artisans whose work contributed significantly to their kingdom's wealth and prestige. The marriage alliances that were so important to three kingdoms' diplomacy also gave women significant political influence, though this influence was often exercised behind the scenes. Royal women served as diplomatic links between kingdoms, and their children often became important political figures in their own right. The cultural achievements of the period also owed much to women's contributions. While most of the surviving literature from the period was written by men, women were active as patrons of the arts, as performers, and as informal cultural transmitters, who preserved and passed on traditional stories, songs, and customs. The Three Kingdoms period unfolded against a backdrop of environmental changes that significantly influenced the course of political and cultural development. Climate fluctuations, natural disasters, and ecological transformations all played roles in shaping the history of this era. The period experienced several significant climate shifts that affected agricultural productivity and population growth. Warmer periods generally favored Korean agriculture and allowed for population expansion, while cooler periods created stress that could contribute to political instability and conflict. The volcanic eruption of Mount Baekje in 946 CE, just after the end of the Three Kingdoms period, was one of the largest volcanic eruptions in recorded history. While this specific event occurred after our period, similar natural disasters during the Three Kingdoms era would have had profound impacts on the kingdom's development. Deforestation was a significant environmental challenge during this period. The construction of cities, temples, and fortifications required enormous amounts of timber, and the production of iron and other metals required charcoal for fuel. The kingdoms had to develop sophisticated forest management practices to ensure sustainable supplies of wood and charcoal. The transformation of the Korean landscape through agriculture was equally significant. The creation of terraced rice fields, the draining of wetlands, and the clearing of forests for farmland fundamentally altered the Korean environment. These changes made possible the population growth and economic development that supported the kingdoms, political and cultural achievements, but they also created new environmental challenges. Water management was crucial to the kingdom's success. The construction of irrigation systems, the management of river flooding, and the provision of clean water for growing cities all required sophisticated engineering and administrative capabilities. The kingdoms that could effectively manage their water resources had significant advantages over those that could not. The Three Kingdoms period was not just a Korean story. It was part of a broader East Asian historical narrative that included developments in China, Japan, and other neighboring regions. Understanding these international dimensions is crucial to appreciating the full significance of Korean achievements during this period. The relationship with China was obviously central to Three Kingdoms history, but it was far more complex than a simple story of Chinese dominance and Korean resistance. Chinese dynasties were often divided and weak, and Korean kingdoms sometimes intervened in Chinese civil wars or provided refuge for Chinese political exiles. The relationship with Japan was equally complex. Korean kingdoms maintained extensive cultural and commercial relationships with Japan throughout this period, and Korean immigrants played crucial roles in Japanese political and cultural development. The fall of Baekje led to a significant wave of Korean immigration to Japan, and these immigrants brought with them advanced knowledge of Buddhism, Confucianism, architecture, and other cultural achievements. The kingdoms also maintained relationships with various nomadic peoples of the northern steppes, with Southeast Asian kingdoms, and even with more distant regions through the Silk Road trade networks. These relationships brought new ideas, technologies, and cultural influences to Korea, while spreading Korean achievements to other parts of the world. The international dimensions of Three Kingdoms history remind us that Korea was never an isolated peninsula, but was always part of broader regional and global networks of cultural and commercial exchange. Korean achievements during this period were both distinctively Korean and part of the broader human story of cultural development and exchange. As we reach the true conclusion of our expanded journey through the Three Kingdoms period, we are left with questions that transcend the specific historical circumstances of ancient Korea, are the eternal questions that every civilization must answer. How do we balance individual freedom with collective security? How do we preserve our cultural identity while adapting to changing circumstances? How do we create institutions that can survive the test of time while remaining responsive to human needs? The Three Kingdoms period offers no easy answers to these questions, but it does provide examples of how one people grappled with these challenges over the course of nearly a millennium. The Korean approach emphasizing strategic patience, cultural synthesis, and long-term thinking offers insights that remain relevant to our contemporary world. The period also reminds us that history is not just about the rise and fall of political entities, but about the human capacity for resilience, creativity, and hope in the face of seemingly impossible challenges. The people of the Three Kingdoms period lived through centuries of warfare, political upheaval, and social transformation. Yet they managed to create works of art, literature, and architecture that continue to inspire us today. Their story is ultimately a testament to the human spirit, to our ability to find meaning and beauty, even in the darkest of times, to build something lasting from the raw materials of existence, and to pass on to future generations not just our failures and tragedies, but our highest aspirations and greatest achievements. The influence of the Three Kingdoms period extends far beyond the boundaries of Korea and the limitations of time. In the bustling streets of modern Seoul, where ancient palaces stand surrounded by gleaming skyscrapers, the spirit of the Three Kingdoms lives on in ways both obvious and subtle. Korean popular culture, which has captivated global audiences in recent decades, draws heavily on themes and aesthetics that originated during the Three Kingdoms period. The emphasis on honor, loyalty, and sacrifice that characterizes many Korean dramas can be traced back to the Hwarang ideals of Silla. The complex political intrigue and strategic thinking that make Korean historical dramas so compelling reflect patterns of thought that were established during the ancient period. The Korean approach to international relations, which emphasizes cultural diplomacy alongside political and economic engagement, follows precedents established by the Three Kingdoms. Just as Baekje used cultural influence to extend its reach beyond its military capabilities, modern Korea uses cultural exports like K-pop, Korean dramas, and Korean cuisine to build soft power and international goodwill. The Korean emphasis on education and technological innovation, which has been so crucial to the country's modern development, also has roots in the Three Kingdoms period. The kingdom's investment in schools, libraries, and centers of learning established a cultural pattern that continues to influence Korean society today. Even Korea's approach to dealing with division and the dream of reunification draws on precedents from the Three Kingdoms period. The memory of Silla's successful unification of the peninsula provides a historical model for contemporary hopes of Korean reunification, while the complex relationships between the ancient kingdoms offer insights into how different Korean political entities might coexist and eventually merge. Perhaps most importantly, the Three Kingdoms period established philosophical and ethical frameworks that continue to influence Korean thought and behavior. The synthesis of Buddhist compassion, Confucian social responsibility, and indigenous Korean values created a distinctive Korean worldview that emphasizes harmony, perseverance, and the importance of community. This philosophical inheritance is visible in contemporary Korean approaches to business, politics, and social organization. The Korean concept of nunchi, the ability to read social situations and respond, appropriately reflects the diplomatic skills that were so crucial to survival during the Three Kingdoms period. The Korean emphasis on group harmony and consensus building draws on Confucian ideals that were refined and adapted during the ancient period. The Korean understanding of time as cyclical rather than linear, which influences everything from business planning to personal relationships, reflects Buddhist concepts of impermanence and rebirth that became central to Korean culture during the Three Kingdoms period. This cyclical view of time encourages long-term thinking and patience in the face of temporary setbacks, qualities that have served Korea well throughout its history. The Korean concept of jeng, a complex emotion that combines affection, loyalty, and mutual obligation, also has roots in the social relationships that were so important during the Three Kingdoms period. Jeng reflects the understanding that individual survival and success depend on maintaining strong relationships with family, friends, and community members. The artistic traditions established during the Three Kingdoms period continue to influence Korean creative expression in ways that are both direct and subtle. Traditional Korean music, with its emphasis on emotional expression and spiritual depth, draws on musical forms that were developed during the ancient period. The Goguryeo and other traditional instruments continue to be played and appreciated, while contemporary Korean musicians often incorporate traditional elements into modern compositions. Korean architecture, from traditional hanok houses to modern buildings, continues to reflect aesthetic principles that were established during the Three Kingdoms period. The emphasis on harmony with natural surroundings, the use of natural materials, and the creation of spaces that promote contemplation and social interaction all have roots in ancient Korean architectural traditions. Korean visual arts, including both traditional forms like calligraphy and painting, and contemporary forms like film and digital art, continue to draw on themes and aesthetics that originated during the Three Kingdoms period. The Korean approach to visual composition, with its emphasis on balance, simplicity, and emotional resonance, reflects artistic principles that were refined during the ancient period. Even Korean cuisine, which has become increasingly popular worldwide, reflects cultural patterns that were established during the Three Kingdoms period. The emphasis on fermentation, the use of seasonal ingredients, and the importance of sharing meals as a form of social bonding all have roots in ancient Korean food culture. The technological innovations of the Three Kingdoms period also continue to influence Korean development in unexpected ways. The Korean tradition of technological adaptation and improvement, which has been so crucial to the country's modern economic success, was established during the ancient period when Korean craftsmen learned to adapt Chinese technologies to Korean conditions and needs. The Korean approach to urban planning, which emphasizes the integration of natural and built environments, draws on principles that were developed during the Three Kingdoms period. Ancient Korean cities were designed to work with natural topography rather than against it, and this approach continues to influence contemporary Korean urban development. The Korean tradition of precision craftsmanship, which is visible in everything from traditional pottery to modern electronics, also has roots in the Three Kingdoms period. The attention to detail and commitment to quality that characterized ancient Korean metalwork and ceramics continues to influence Korean manufacturing and design. The story of the Three Kingdoms period resonates with people around the world because it addresses universal human themes and challenges. The struggle between unity and diversity, the tension between tradition and innovation, and the challenge of maintaining identity while adapting to change are issues that every society must confront. The Korean experience during the Three Kingdoms period offers insights that are relevant to contemporary global challenges. The Korean approach to cultural synthesis, taking the best elements from different traditions while maintaining a distinctive identity, provides a model for how societies can engage with globalization. while preserving their unique characteristics. The Korean emphasis on long-term thinking and strategic patience offers lessons for contemporary leaders who must navigate complex international relationships and domestic challenges. The Korean understanding that temporary setbacks can be overcome through persistence and adaptation provides hope for societies facing difficult circumstances. The Korean achievement of unification after centuries of division offers inspiration for other divided societies around the world. The Korean experience demonstrates that even the most entrenched divisions can be overcome through skillful leadership, strategic thinking, and a shared commitment to common goals. As we conclude this expanded exploration of the Three Kingdoms period, it's important to remember that this story is not finished. The themes, patterns, and lessons of the ancient period continue to unfold in contemporary Korean history and in the broader human story of which Korea is a part. The division of Korea after World War II and the ongoing efforts toward reunification represent a continuation of the ancient struggle between unity and division that characterized the Three Kingdoms period. The Korean War and its aftermath echo the ancient conflicts between Korean kingdoms and foreign powers. The remarkable economic and cultural development of South Korea in recent decades reflects the same creative energy and determination that characterized the ancient kingdoms. The global spread of Korean culture through the Korean Wave represents a new chapter in Korea's long history of cultural diplomacy and international engagement. Just as the ancient kingdoms used cultural influence to extend their reach and build relationships with neighboring peoples, contemporary Korea uses cultural exports to build soft power and international goodwill. The ongoing challenges facing Korea, from demographic changes to environmental concerns to international tensions, require the same qualities of strategic thinking, cultural creativity, and social cohesion that enabled the ancient kingdoms to survive and thrive. The lessons of the Three Kingdoms period remain relevant because the fundamental challenges of human society remain constant even as their specific manifestations change. And so we return, one final time, to the image of the eternal dance with which our story began. The Three Kingdoms of ancient Korea have taken their final bow, but the dance continues with new performers and new music. The stage has changed, the costumes are different, and the audience has grown to include the entire world. But the fundamental human drama remains the same. We are all participants in this great dance of history, each of us playing our part in the ongoing human story of struggle and achievement, conflict and cooperation, division and unity. The people of the Three Kingdoms period faced challenges that were both unique to their time and universal to the human condition. Their responses to these challenges, their successes and failures, their wisdom and folly, their courage and fear offer us both inspiration and instruction as we face our own challenges. The misty mountains of ancient Korea still stand, though the kingdoms that once ruled from their peaks are gone. The rivers still flow, though the cities on their banks have been rebuilt many times. The seasons still change, though the people who once marked their passage with ancient festivals have been replaced by new generations with new customs. But something essential remains: the human capacity for hope, for creativity, for resilience in the face of adversity. The people of the Three Kingdoms period demonstrated these qualities in ways that continue to inspire us today. Their story reminds us that we too are capable of great things, that we too can overcome seemingly impossible challenges, and that we too can leave a legacy that will inspire future generations. The dance of the Three Kingdoms is ended, but the music they created echoes on, calling each new generation to take up the eternal human task of building civilizations worthy of our highest aspirations. In their memory, in their achievements, and in their enduring influence on Korean culture and the broader human story, the kingdoms of Goguryeo, Baekje, and Silla achieve a kind of immortality that transcends the limitations of time and mortality. Their story becomes our story, their struggles become our struggles, and their dreams become our dreams. In remembering them, we remember what it means to be human. In honoring their achievements, we commit ourselves to achieving great things in our own time. In learning from their mistakes, we prepare ourselves to face our own challenges with wisdom and courage. The Three Kingdoms period was more than just a chapter in Korean history. It was a foundational moment in the human story, a time when a people discovered what they were capable of achieving when they combined courage with wisdom, tradition with innovation, and individual ambition with collective purpose. Their legacy lives on, not just in Korea, but wherever human beings strive to create something beautiful and meaningful from the raw materials of existence. And in that striving, in that eternal human effort to build something better than what came before, the spirit of the Three Kingdoms lives on, as vibrant and inspiring today as it was over 1,000 years ago, when the last of the ancient kingdoms took their final bow and passed into the realm of memory and legend. The story is ended, but the dance continues, and we are all dancers in it, carrying forward the hopes and dreams of all who came before us, adding our own steps to the eternal choreography of human civilization, and preparing the stage for all who will come after us in the great, unending performance of human history.